guys can have a seat. Thank you. If you're a note taker, all these notes are in our app. If you're new here, on the back of that connection card is instructions on how to download the app. And so all these notes and verses, anything we put on the screen will be in that. Just as a starting point today, I want to ask the question, who will you trust? We live in a time similar to that of ancient Judah and Israel, where as a divided nation, we often trust in human leadership more than God. God's warning to the people through Isaiah is a warning to us as well. Can you keep that up there for me just for a second, Justine? So here's the story of Israel. If you back up to David, where we just read as David the psalmist, as he is really submitted to God and his kingdom is flourishing, he will hand off to his son. They will actually fortify what David grew. And then Solomon will hand off to his son. Anybody know his son's name? Only one person. Want to know why? Because Jeroboam, right? About destroys the nation. Want to know how he does it? He turns away from God. Just a couple generations later, what we have is one nation divided becomes two. And as these two nations begin to not only be divided, become separate, they begin to war against each other. So imagine this, the people of God, when you back up here, we're all together. And then as things take place, they tend to divide. And then not only divide as if they're different, but they begin to be warring factions, if you will. Now just pause there for a minute and consider, we're about to enter into another election cycle as a nation. Right? Already people are rallying and saying, hey, I'm going to run or I'm whatever, all this stuff, right? And it's not for quite a while. It's going to be another long election season. And it's going to cause, because people on both sides of the aisle are going to cause division. They're going to point out the division and highlight the division in our nation. And they're going to capitalize on that kind of politic. And as we see that, we see both sides grow more polarized and begin to argue and fight within each other. And instead of being a united country, we seem to find ourselves more and more divided, and that's true within the church as well. We tend to see these things divide us and not bring us together. And so when we ask this question, who will you trust? We live in a time that's similar to that of ancient Judah and Israel, where as a divided nation, we often trust in human leadership more than God. We don't have a king, but we have a president. We have Congress and senators. We have local leadership. We have all those things, and we tend to find ourselves trusting in that more than God. God's warning to the people through Isaiah is a warning to us as well. So Isaiah 7, if you're there, if you have it's in the app again, if you have a Bible, if you want to turn there, I'm going to start in verse 1. It says, in the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, the king of Judah. I know there's a bunch of words you've probably never heard before, right? Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, the king of Israel, came up to Jerusalem to wage war against it, but could not yet mount an attack against it. So let me just do this. So I got to, on Friday, and I won't embarrass anybody in the second row like the even houses at all, but I got to go see Valley Christian's Broadway showcase in La Mirada, and a couple different families from our church are a part of Valley Christian. Valley Christian does this big thing, I guess, every year, and this was a celebration of 20 years of it. And so oftentimes you'll find yourself sitting in a seat, and you're thinking, okay, now, wait a minute, which one is which, and who's in what number, and you're seeing students that I get to speak at Valley a lot. I get to hang out with their board of directors, their staff, their high school, their junior high. And so you're seeing faces, and you're like, okay, I kind of recognize what's going on here. And I see the people for sure I know, but I know that these people look familiar too. And you get this playbill, and you get this list of everybody who's there, and you get to read through it. And it tells you, okay, this person's in this number. And this person did this part, or this solo, or this other thing in this number. And you get this kind of, this direction, this bulletin to kind of give you what's going on. Isaiah 7 should come with one of those, okay? Everybody in it is going to get like 3 or 4 different names. Now, bear in mind, when we say that Washington, D.C. makes a decision, we know who we're talking about, right? We know what country we're talking about. We say the U.S., right? When we say United States, we say America. Whatever we say, We're talking about one thing, but it has lots of names, right? Does that make sense? That there's a way that we refer to ourselves that is common amongst us, that is common even in the world. Many of those things you could say in Europe, and they would all understand what we were talking about. Now, fast forward almost 3 millennia, and probably those terms are different. In fact, many of the nations are different. Like Assyria is the big empire right now, and Assyria doesn't really exist anymore. But Syria, Israel, those still exist, and Judah, pretty much gone. And so there's names for these people. I'm just going to kind of walk through this so that we understand. And there's really 4 things going. There's 4 groups of people. There's Judah and Israel, and those were the people of God that have divided. And at this point, Judah is the better of the two. Israel is the worse of the two. Now, they used to all be called Israel, but they've divided, separated, become a northern and southern kingdom. We're going to see their kings, right? Ahaz is the king of Judah, and Remaliah is the king of Israel at the time. Rezin's from Syria. Now, Syria is a country that still exists, so we kind of are familiar with that. But then there's a kingdom or an empire, Assyria, and his name is never mentioned, but it's Tiglath-Pileser III. Not that you need to remember that ever, right? This was my worst class, by the way, in seminary. Secular history of biblical times, and all these words and names were not my favorite. So bear with me. I wish I'd paid more attention back then. So there's this gigantic empire, right? And they are taking new ground. They are displacing people groups. And every small nation around there is fearful for this big nation. Because this big nation, this big empire is coming through and conquering people. And they're waging wars against the smaller places around them. So the smaller places would be like Syria, Judah, Israel. All those nations are fearful. And so what they're doing in the midst of this is they're gathering together and they're forming kind of like partnerships, right? So that they can stand up against one another. And then they're going, these little partnerships are going to the other little nations and they're saying, listen, join with us, help us fight against Assyria. And if the people say no, then they fight against them. So it's really join with us, or we're going to do the same thing that the big empire is doing, and we're going to try and conquer you. So all this has been going on, and Syria and Israel are partnering together. Not something you would see in our modern history, right? And so they're partnered together at this time, and they're going against Judah. Now, Judah is also, the capital of that is Jerusalem, right? And so I know it gets confusing, but they're now warring against each other. And Ahaz is a 20-year-old man who ascends to the throne at a very young age, and he begins with an opportunity from God to be obedient, unlike those before him, those in Israel, and those after him. But we get like kind of a zoomed-in glimpse of something that takes place in the midst of that, where God reaches out to this king. So I'm going to start back at verse 1 again. In the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, the king of Judah, Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, the king of Israel, came up to Jerusalem to wage war against it, but could not yet mount an attack against it. Now, this story is retold in Kings and Chronicles, and this story is told a few different places. And here's what we know about this. The reason that these two nations, as they join together and try and attack Judah, the reason that they cannot wage war against it is because God is prohibiting it. So God is sovereignly intervening in this geopolitical struggle 2,700, 2,800 years ago. And in this moment, as he holds back the nations that want to come in and wipe out Judah, he has this moment where he reaches out to Ahaz and gives Ahaz an opportunity to not be like the rest of those around him. So verse 2, when the house of David, that's another name for Ahaz and the kingdom of Judah, Syria is in league with Ephraim, which is another name for Israel. Again, you require a playbill to read through this thing, right? The heart of Ahaz, the king of Judah, and the heart of the people shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind. So here's what we get. As these two nations collect outside there, and God is holding them off, but they see this. They can see the nations around them. They can see what's going on. They've been warned. The messengers have told them. The armies are encamping outside of them. And it says that Ahaz the king and the people of Judah tremble like trees in the wind in a forest, right? So fear. A note for you. When things of this world cause us to fear, it shows us that our trust is misplaced. If our trust was in God, our fear and worry would be eased. And so just consider this. If Ahaz was trusting in God, if Ahaz was believing that, listen, God's the one that's keeping everybody off of you right now. Like he's the one that can prevent this. And you have an opportunity to be a follower of God. Now remember, Judah still professes, so does Israel at this time, they still profess to be a nation that follows God. Sound familiar? But in this moment, what we see in Ahaz is he doesn't trust in God. In fact, what he trusts in is he's doing a head count of how many people he's got, he's doing a head count of how many people they got, and he's fearful. He's comparing army size and saying he's on the short end of it. And so he and the people, he and the citizens, he and the people that live in Judah are both fearful because his trust isn't in God. His trust is in what he can see. Verse 3, and the Lord said to Isaiah, go out and meet Ahaz, you and Shear-Jashub, your son, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool, the highway of the washer's field. So God calls Isaiah the prophet, the author of this book, the prophet that we are following through this journey, as he has been working with different kings. He's outlived some of the kings, right? He will see different people reign. Just like you and I will see different presidents throughout our lifetime, Isaiah gets to live and be a prophet in the different seasons of different kings. And so God calls Isaiah to go in and speak to the king Ahaz. Verse 4, and it says to him, say to him, God tells Isaiah, say to him, be careful and be quiet and do not fear. And do not let your heart be faint because of these two smoldering stumps of firebrands at the fierce anger of Rezin and Syria and the son of Remaliah, meaning Israel. So I want to put up, you guys have seen this, right? Everybody seen this? Everyone has seen this. This thing's been played out, right? And there has been so many versions of this thing. Now, most people don't really know where it came from. In fact, I had no idea where it came from. But as I was reading this passage and looking at what God was saying, I thought, oh, it's like that keep calm graphic, right? This is actually something from World War II. This was something that the British government did in order to kind of help soothe their people. And here's the story. So if you know anything about geopolitical history, which even those words, most people, Gen X or millennial, just kind of tune out, right? Like that's not kind of what we're known for sure, right? World War II, the new fear was that military airstrikes had ramped up to such a capacity that there was a fear everywhere that something from the sky was going to kill you. Right? It was no longer just the swords and the guns standing in front of you. It was now like a legitimate air war. This was the big fear, that people flying so high up in the sky in bombers that could drop large bombs that you may not even see them or hear them. And then there was all the airstrikes, all the fighter pilots and all those that you could come in and you would see them in hordes like tons of geese or ducks or whatever. You see them in the sky, except they'd be really loud. And the next thing you know, and there's other ones and they're shooting and they're blowing up in the sky. And so there was this fear, a lot like would have been felt after Pearl Harbor if you lived in Honolulu. A lot like we went through after 9/11, that there was this sense of this thing you couldn't see because terrorism came, and it came in a way that you couldn't see. Whether you like them or not, there were some amazingly soothing things that George W. Bush said as he spoke to the nation and promised that this would not go unanswered. But if you back up to World War II, this was created. And the British government was trying to calm the people because they were fearful of these things that might take place that they had no power over. So keep that in mind for a second. We'll leave that up for a minute. Verse 4. and say to him, so Israel, God says to Isaiah to go to Ahaz, he says, and say to him, be careful, be quiet, do not fear. Do not let your heart be faint because of these two smoldering stumps of firebrands at the fierce anger of Syria and Israel. He calls these two nations that want to attack them burned out stumps. Just imagine a tree cut off and burned out, right? One commentator said, consider like cigarette butts put out in an ashtray. I'm not sure that's a biblical reference, but you get the point, right? He says, don't be afraid of them. Like their time is done. They've burned their way out. Their time here on earth is short. Don't fear them. Be calm, right? Be quiet. Trust in me. That's what God is saying. So God has sent Isaiah to the king. This king who is worried about the armies in front of him, worried about what he can see, worried about what he cannot control, but what he can see. And his worry is based in this. I don't think I'm built, or our country is built to withstand that. Psalm 20, that verse we read earlier. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. They collapse and fall, but we rise and stand upright. So King David, a few generations prior, he wrote, listen, some trust in chariots and horses, but I trust in God. Right? And he lived that way. Now, he was by far not a perfect guy, like lots of problems. But in the end, he was a godly man who followed God and built a nation. And as he did that, as he's writing down these worship songs called Psalms, he's writing things like other people trust in chariots and horses, but I'm going to trust in the name of God. They fall, God doesn't. And so you can see the contrast as we look at Ahaz in Isaiah. Verse 5, it says, because Syria with Ephraim and the son of Remaliah has devised evil against you, let us go up against Judah and terrify it, and let us conquer it for ourselves, and set up the son of Tabeel as the king in the midst of it. Thus says the Lord God, it shall not stand, and it shall not come to pass. For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. With only 65 years, Ephraim will be shattered from being a people. So again, lots of different ways of saying the same thing. Syria and Israel want to attack you, and they want to come in and displace you, and they want to set up their own king. He says, but within 65 years, that nation will be gone. So imagine you're a king, and I have no idea what this might be like. But imagine you're that king, and you can see the armies, and you can see what exists at a distance. And you know you don't have the ability to stop that, but here's God. God is sending his messenger out of nowhere to you. It says, listen, don't worry about them. Like their time, they're on a clock, and the clock's almost out. And those nations will be gone. All you got to do is trust in me. Verse 9, it says, and the head of Ephraim, meaning Israel, is Samaria, meaning Syria. And the head of Samaria is the son of Remaliah. If you are not firm in faith, you will not be firm at all. If you are not firm in faith, you will not be firm at all. Another way, one commentator translated that sentence. There's an effort in the Hebrew, in the way this is written, there's an effort because there's a word play in the original language. So if you're not firm in faith, you will not be firm at all. There's a way that they're trying to put these together. Another translator said this, if you do not live by faith, you will not live at all. And this is what God is saying, like you have one out. You can't fight your way out. You can't talk your way out. You can't think your way out. You can't buy your way out. You have one way out. Faith. You have God. This is your way out. And you have a choice. You're at this crossroads. Now, a lot of us in far less severe ways, or at least we're not leading kingdoms and nations, but a lot of us find ourselves in places like that, where if we go this way, this is one command. If we go this way, this is another one. Sometimes there's this place where like, okay, it looks like in order to trust God, we have to go this way, but this causes a bit of anxiety too because we can't see what's on the other side over here. But it seems like if we go over this way, this doesn't end well either. And oftentimes, and maybe more subtle ways, God will say, listen, either you live by faith or you don't. Either you place your trust in me or you don't. But we'll often find ourselves at those crossroads. Ahaz, in a very big, in a very public, in a very life-altering way, is finding himself in this. So if you're a note taker, where's our faith? Christians are called to live by faith in God, yet almost everything we do trusts human things: health, work, finances, transportation, education, etc. What if God proclaimed, trust in me, or I will take everything else away? We talk about 9/11. Not long after was a massive crash in America, right? The markets collapsed, the housing markets collapsed, stock markets, all that collapsed. People lost jobs. I pastored 2 churches right around the collapse. I was handing one off and starting another. One was in Orange County, one was in the Inland Empire. And I saw a significant difference. The folks that we pastored in Orange County were losing their retirements and their businesses were declining and they were laying people off. The church I pastored in the high desert, on the other side of that, the people were being laid off and they were losing their houses and things like that. And there's this sense that people will press in and cling to God when things are incredibly terrible. When things are incredibly challenging, people will really press into their faith. But they soon forget that. Because truly, once we get back on track, say you lose your job and you're fearful of losing your house and you're pressing into God and you're praying more and you're in church more, you're doing whatever it is for you that you're doing more and you're pressing into God, and God provides a way through. God provides this job and you don't lose your home or you don't lose this or whatever, and you seem to survive it. But a lot of times people will then press into that job and they will work so much that it pulls them away from their family, their church, their faith. And they begin to trust in that job because it's that job that saved them from losing their home, not the God that provided that job. Verse 10, but the Lord spoke to Ahaz. He says, ask a sign of the Lord your God. Now, at this point, the language is to Ahaz, the Lord your God. Like, you're in. God's your God, right? And so the Lord spoke to Ahaz, ask the sign of the Lord your God to let it be deep as shale or high as heaven. But Ahaz said, I will not ask. I will not put the Lord to the test. So here's what happens. God goes to Ahaz and he really gives him a blank check. He says, listen, I want you to ask for me a sign and I'll prove it to you. And what Ahaz does almost sounds godly, but it's incredibly not godly. And he kind of chairs this answer as if it's spiritual. I will not ask. I will not put the Lord to the test. And it sounds almost spiritual, like, no, I'm going to trust God. I don't need a sign. It's not what he's saying. He's saying, I'm not going to trust God. God said, you can ask me for anything right here, and I will show you. Give you a sign. Ask for anything, and I will give you that sign so that you know you can trust me with these surrounding armies. And again, remember this whole context, this whole passage. For the rest of this chapter, they're right there at the edge of the nation. They're ready to conquer, ready to come into the nation and devour them. They're there. And it's in that moment that God is having this conversation through Isaiah to the king. And he's saying, listen, how can I get you to trust me? How about if I show you a sign? Tell me, what sign you want me to show you, right? Seriously, it's like pick a card, any card. I'll tell you what it is, right? Like, what do I have to do to get you to believe that I'm your way through this? And Ahaz just simply says no. Like, no. I put this up, and I just want to pause here for a minute. Ignoring God. Ahaz has an opportunity to trust in God, but he declines God's invitation, so God withdraws the author. Whether it's pride or fear or whatever that causes Ahaz to say no, opportunities to follow God that exist today might not be available tomorrow. I don't know what it is that stops Ahaz. There's nothing that really says Ahaz is afraid of following God, or he's too prideful to follow God, or he is, who knows what it is. But it does give us a chance to pause and ask, what is it in us that causes us to not take that next step of faith? Like, we're good being at the edge of faith, but we're not really ready to say, hey, Jesus, I want to follow you. Or we're good of kind of being in, like, okay, we're a Christian and we've been baptized, but I'm really not ready to give everything. Like, what is it that causes us to keep God at arm's length? Whatever prohibits us, those opportunities that are here today aren't always going to be here. And they're not guaranteed for tomorrow. And this is what Ahaz will learn. This moment is over. And I would never want that to be us, right? Not that it isn't. I'm just saying that we should see that. Verse 13, and he said, hear then. Now, this is Isaiah speaking. I want you to hear the change in the language. And he said, hear then, O house of David, which is another name for Ahaz and Judah. Is it too little for you to weary men that you may weary my God also? We've gone from your God, Ahaz, to my God, Isaiah says. Because this is not your God. Because God is not your God. Because you don't want God to be your God. 2 Kings is a parallel story to this. It says this, so Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, I am your servant and your son. Come up and rescue me from the hand of the king of Syria and from the hand of the king of Israel who are attacking me. Here's what happens in this moment. Ahaz, king of Judah, sends to Tiglath-Pileser, and he says, hey, listen, you're the big dog. You're Assyria. You're the big empire. Hey, I'll be yours. I'll be yours. Your servant and your son, come up and rescue me. So in this moment, he denies God. He says, I'll go with the big army instead. Now, from the outside, we look at this and we're just like, oh, this is heartbreaking. Like, why? Why would you do that? But we've got to admit, we do it all the time, right? Like, the easy answer is the answer we can see. Oh, take that job. It pays more money. That's an easy answer. Well, maybe God doesn't have it for you. I don't know, right? Do this thing or do that thing. Where God is over here saying, no, listen, just trust me. And we make those decisions all the time. This one's a big one, right? This one is a very visible one. It may not have been as visible in that moment, except God sends somebody to speak to him. And I know sometimes God sends people to speak to us as well. But this is not exclusive to a man named Ahaz. This is our story, right? Verse 14, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Now, if you are familiar with the Bible, this is a very familiar passage, right? This is a passage that we get to hear at Christmas time and at other places. If you're not familiar with Scripture, that's okay. We're going to unpack this one today. It's going to take a little bit. We're going to do this. Here's what happens in this verse. Prophecy, or what Isaiah is a prophet, and a prophet tends to speak on behalf of God with God's authority, okay? So he'll go in and speak to Ahaz. Ahaz, here's an opportunity. God says, trust him. Ask for a sign. Do whatever you will, and God will do it for you. Ahaz declines, and Ahaz makes another decision. So on God's behalf, Isaiah says, okay, listen, no longer your God. Now we're going to talk about it as my God because you've said no, right? So sometimes a prophet will speak something that is going to happen in the future. Christians tend to think of prophecy as something that is future telling. Most of the time it's not. Most of the time it was very near to the moment, or it was about that moment. Like Isaiah has been prophesying the whole time. Like, hey, God said, you want a sign? Just pick a sign. He'll give it to you. That's real time, not future, right? Hey, no longer your God, my God. That's current, right? And then this very thing right here is going to be fulfilled in a short window of time, but there's two promises made here. And what we're going to do is we're going to let Isaiah unpack the two promises made here because he'll show us both of them. So he'll show us one that's for the future and one that's for Ahaz. And so I'm going to start over with this. We're going to go one promise at a time so it kind of helps us understand it. So verse 14, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son and shall call his name Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse evil and choose good. For before the boy knows how to refuse evil and choose good, the land whose two kings you dread will be deserted. Now, does that next statement about this child to be born, does that sound like it's very, very close to happening? No. Okay, it should. Before this boy who's born is able to discern right from wrong, the two nations that are standing at your door, they're going to be destroyed. Right? We're not talking about something thousands of years in the future. We're talking about something that's going to be in this current lifetime, right? Does that make sense? So it defines it clearly, because when churches get squirrely around prophecy, let's just be honest, right? Like it's hard to look at this and try and figure out, okay, how does this end up landing where it lands? And how did the hearer understand it? Ahaz would have heard this. Those guys at your doorstep right now, they're going to die. They're going to die soon. And here's a sign. You know how you didn't want a sign? I'm giving you one anyhow, but now it's a sign that what I'm going to do is true. You're just not included in it. Does that make sense? So here's the sign. There's going to be a child born, and that child, before it knows how to choose right from wrong, within that amount of time, these nations will be destroyed. Okay? Let Isaiah unpack this for us. Verse 17, then the Lord will bring upon you and upon your people and upon your father's house such days have not come since the day of Ephraim departed Judah, since the northern kingdom split. Days are going to come on you that you haven't seen since then. And Judah will die also, right? And so it says this, have not come since the day of Ephraim departed Judah, the king of Assyria. And so note that the king of Assyria is going to come in and start wiping out all these nations. That's what Isaiah is saying. Verse 18, in that day the Lord will whistle for the fly that is at the end of the streams of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. And this is language that would make sense if you lived in Judah 2,700 years ago, right? That Egypt had, that the flies that would come up from Egypt and the bees from Assyria, they're talking about the nation's armies coming in with this visible, distant sound that kind of grows as they're getting closer to you. And again, the only thing I could liken this to is if you lived during World War II, you would hear maybe fighter planes or bombers or things, you could hear them coming sometimes from a distance if they were low enough until the noise, the roar from those engines grew and they got to you, and it was an ominous sound. And so that's what God is saying through Isaiah. Listen, here's what's going to happen. They're going to start coming in from Egypt and from Assyria. And that day the Lord will whistle. So God will cause this. God is going to cause these nations to come in and destroy you. Now remember, there's two at the door. There's two at the edge of your land. Those two armies, they're not going to do it. God said, I'm going to call for the other army. Now notice that Ahaz reaches out and he goes straight to Assyria. He goes to the big empire. And who does God say he's going to use to destroy Judah? Assyria, the big empire. You know the ones you just aligned with, you thought were your buddies? They're actually going to displace you. They're the ones that are going to do it. And God's going to cause this. So the loss of everything. Here's what Ahaz is dealing with right now. Ahaz was offered everything he needed by God, but chose to trust in his own human solution. For this choice, Ahaz has lost everything. Where has God called us to trust in him that we might still be choosing other things? Like, where has God called us to lay down fears, pride, control, belief? That God might be trying to do something else in us. So God goes on through Isaiah, verse 19, we'll go through this pretty quickly. And they will all come and settle in steep ravines and the clefts of the rocks and on all the thorn bushes and all the pastures. And in that day the Lord will shave with a razor that is hired beyond the river with the king of Assyria, the head of the hair of the feet, and it will sweep away the beard also. This shaving of people was a way that they would come in. When an army would come in and take over, they would shave the men's heads and their beards, and it was a way of humiliating them. And then they'd parade them through town. And so God says, listen, and you, not only will be conquered, but you're going to be humiliated as well. Verse 21, in that day, a man will keep alive a young cow and 2 sheep, and because of the abundance of milk that they give, he will eat curds. And everyone who is left in the land will eat curds and honey. And this can sound like, hey, there's going to be plenty of food. But here's what he's saying. There's going to be so few people, you'll have plenty to eat. Because there will be more cows than there will be people. And so everyone will be, like the ones that are left, that's what he's saying. There's going to be so few people left that the food will seem like plenty even after war. Verse 23, in that day, every place where there used to be 1,000 vines worth thousands of shekels of silver will become briars and thorns. With bow and arrows a man will come there, for all the land will be briars and thorns. And as for all the hills that used to be hoed up with a hoe, you will not come there for fear of briars and thorns, because they will become a place where cattle are let loose and where sheep tread. What he's saying is a once rich nation will be nothing but thorns and land that doesn't produce. Chapter 8, verse 1 says this. Then the Lord said to me, and so God is now speaking to Isaiah, take a large tablet and write on it with common characters belonging to Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz, and I will get reliable witnesses, Uriah the priest and Zechariah the son of Jerebekiah, to attest for me. So these are a couple of the other prophets. But the first son's name, so he's saying, Isaiah, now I need you to go and have a son. And this is important because there's two promises made in that verse 14 that we'll get back to in a minute. And the first promise is going to happen imminently, and the second promise is going to happen over time. And so now God is giving Isaiah direction on how to fulfill the promise and how to bring about the sign. So he says, go and have a son, and here's his name. And I'm not going to try and pronounce that again because I have no idea what I'm saying. But it translates quick to plunder, quick to the spoil. In other words, this nation is going to be easy to destroy and easy to glean all that they have. Verse 3, so Isaiah says this, so I went to the prophetess, meaning his wife, and she conceived and bore a son. And then the Lord said to me, call his name Maher-shalal-hash-baz. So I said it again. All right. Isaiah and his new wife go, and they have their first son. Now, Isaiah has a son from another wife, and it's believed that she died or something happened. But he has one son. He takes a new wife according to God's plan, and he has a child. And this is the first fulfillment of that verse. So this is the thing that's going to happen in Ahaz's time. I know it gets a little down in the weeds, but I want this as important as it wraps up. So bear with me. There's a promise, and the promise really is kind of two promises, if you will. One right now, and one that will happen in the future. And God is unpacking the one that's going to happen right now. And Isaiah's writing about it as Isaiah is a part of that story. This is going to be the son that is the sign that before he knows how to choose right from wrong. So a couple years, right? A year to have one, a couple years to start figuring out right from wrong. Let's call it less than 5 years. Within less than 5 years, these two nations that are trying to conquer you will be completely destroyed. And then you're also going to be destroyed because of your unfaithfulness. And so God tells Isaiah, I want you to go have a son. Here's the son's name. The poor kid gets stuck with his name just to prove a point by God, right? And this is how it's going to unfold for King Ahaz. Verse 4, for before the boy knows how to cry, my father, my mother, the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away before the king of Assyria. The Lord spoke to me again, because this people has refused the waters of Shiloh that flowed gently, and rejoice over Rezin the son of Remaliah. Therefore, behold, the Lord is bringing up against them the waters of the river, mighty and many, the king of Assyria and all his glory. It will rise over the channels and go over the banks. Here's what he's saying. Because you didn't want my provision, that's the meaning behind the waters of Shiloh. Because you didn't want what I had for you, I'm going to cause a flood, an army, the Assyrians, to come in and overshadow all of you. And so this is the sign, Isaiah, your son, before your son can say my mom or my dad, this is what will happen to Judah, to Israel, to Syria. Assyria will come in and wipe them out. So I'm going to put this back up. This is what we read in the last passage. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. So here's what happened. God has made this promise. And God has said, here's how things are going to unfold, and here's what's going to happen to your nation because you would not take my help, because you did not believe in me, because you chose to go another direction instead of this direction. Here's what's going to happen, and here's going to be your sign. But there's still something left in this verse that God hasn't dealt with yet. And so here's what happens. And we're just going to leave that up there for a minute. And it will sweep on into Judah and overflow and pass on. So this army, like this metaphor of a flood, is going to come in and it's going to sweep over the whole land and overflow the channels and overflow the rivers and overflow the homes. This army is going to come in and destroy. And this army is Assyria. And like a flood, it's going to come in and wipe out the nation that used to be God's people. So it says this, verse 8, and it will sweep on into Judah, and it will overflow and pass on, reaching even to the neck, and its outspread wings will fill the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel. So the second promise in this is that the first thing that will take place is Assyria will come in like a flood and devour the land of Assyria. It will become Assyria, not Judah, not Syria, not Israel, not Philistine, not any of them. It will become Assyria. But then God gets to speak something much bigger, that the sign of this virgin will be a son named Emmanuel who will inherit all the land. Now, if you're a fan of the Bible, you've started to put some pieces together. If you're new to this, let me just read you some words from the Gospel of Matthew. It says this in Matthew 1. Now the birth of Jesus took place in this way. When his mother had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, so while she was still a virgin, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. And she will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. And all this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, meaning Isaiah. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. Remember, I've been saying through this book, because this book is so heavy, so riddled with warnings of destruction, so calling out the people of God and saying, listen, you've all gone astray, that no message in a Christian church should ever end in shame and condemnation or just end in that heavy place without hope, right? I've said that time and time again in these passages because these passages are heavy. He just told them, hey, listen, really, really bad decision on the whole Assyria thing. And now I'm going to come in like a flood and wipe you entirely out. But here's the hope. See, the hope comes that Jesus will come and return and regain the entirety of the land. A virgin will be born, and you shall call his name Jesus, and he shall be called Emmanuel, God with us. See, the gospel is that. The gospel is the story, this large narrative that says there's a God who created us and loves us and designed us and wired us to be followers of God. And that in that we are called into relationship with God. But that every one of us, thousands of years ago, today, tomorrow, as long as we'll live, that we've all chosen to go our own way time and time and time again. And because of those decisions, there's a penalty. And in the eternal sense, the penalty is death. In the eternal sense, the penalty is being separated from God. Sometimes in the temporal sense, there's things like we read about today, or in our sense, we make bad decisions, we have to pay the penalties of our bad decisions. But God says, but for the eternal peace, and even for the redemption of the right now, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to come in and I'm going to bring a king who will always be faithful to me. I'm going to bring a king who is not an unfaithful king like Ahaz. In fact, he's not even a flawed king like David. He is the King of kings and the Lord of lords, Jesus Christ. He's the king that will be born of a virgin, born in poverty, born in obscurity, but he will grow up and he will become the sacrifice for all sin. And ultimately, what he will do is regain all this land. And he's not talking about Israel and Judah. He's talking about this world, that this will be his. And so we get to live inside this story of the coming of Emmanuel, the coming of Jesus, who came and began to right everything that was wrong. And then we get to live in the sense that between now and Jesus' return, we get to participate in seeing people come to know this Jesus. That we get to live inside the hope of God's promises fulfilled in us. And that we get to live in the hope that Jesus will return someday, maybe soon, maybe a long time, who knows? But that he will return and everything that is wrong will be made right. That's every marriage. That's every child. That's every illness. That's every pain. That's every shame. That's everything fulfilled in Emmanuel, God with us. Let's pray. Jesus, we love you. This is your story. This isn't a story about Ahaz or empires. This is a story about you. And that your story is that you are God who entered into our story. And that in that, Jesus, you came to deliver us, really, if we're honest, from ourselves. And then part of that is you deliver us from this world that's broken as well. And in that, Jesus, you offer us yourself. You get to be king. And every one of us, as we stand here today or we sit here today, we have that opportunity of which king we're going to follow. Are we going to follow the kings that we see? Maybe that's going to be the kings of business or the kings of wealth, the kings of education, the kings of fun. Maybe we're our own king in our own life. Maybe that's kings in politics. Or are we going to follow the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, Jesus, you that sit on the throne right now? I pray that wherever we are not following you, Jesus, you would reveal that to us, and that you would welcome us back to follow you. Let us see those opportunities that are put before us and let us take advantage of them, Jesus. It's in your name we pray.